what can we do to achieve a just climate transition in South Africa? If you're wondering if you're in the right place, you're in the right place, indeed. This is the webinar. My name is Mary Galvin. I'm going to be facilitating the webinar. I am a climate activist and also an associate professor in anthropology and development studies at the University of Johannesburg. The University of Johannesburg, Wits University, University of Cape Town, and the University of Western Cape have organized the webinar today. It's part of a global initiative that you'll hear more about with a short video. What we're going to do is I'd like to play this video that positions the event. But as usual, we've given it a very distinctive South African flavor. So the video is the one that's being shown at venues in 50 different countries. So you'll see it's very general, and I'll start out responding to the video and also adding to it in the South African context. That'll all be very short, and then we'll move on to the different presentations that I'll introduce as we go along. Feel free as we go to comment or to contribute in the chat or to ask questions, and we'll respond to those. I also encourage during the webinar, if you have some contributions you want to make, if you have a link or a document or a process or something, we're trying to all come together to share ideas. So please put that in the chat and make sure you raise it. I'll say more about that after we watch this short video. Cabello, can you show the video, please?
Mamthea, can you make me co-host, please? Oh, thank you.
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 US states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Eben Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much-needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the 2 hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon-neutral economy, while the US rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice, and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class, the teacher can assign tonight's webinars homework for the students, and then afterwards have a one-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forward, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
Okay, great. That gives you an idea of the Solve Climate by 2030 initiative and the scope that they've been embarking on globally. But when I watched that video, it raised some questions immediately. One is the question that we're hoping to get into, especially with Bright's input next, about youth are the leaders. How do we extend that reach? How do we make sure that it's not the same group of people speaking to each other again and again? When we planned this webinar, we tried really hard to make sure that you weren't hearing from the same people that often speak on these subject matter, but that it was a broader group. So please keep in mind the question of how to build awareness, how to build commitment, how to build change as we go along. But 2 other points came up strongly. The speaker referred to justice, but didn't really say much about justice. And I think that's something we'll be able to get into. Also around the justice between different countries, the developing world and the developed world, but also the justice within the country of emissions and needing to cut emissions, but potentially leading to job losses. The unequal nature of South Africa, where you have emissions by the middle class and by industry, and that being by the elite, but then what? So we pressure everyone to try to adjust lifestyles. So sure, if we carry on as usual, the world loses, we're all losers, but most immediately we have the inequalities and the problems with justice. So we'll touch on those. The second part I found really challenging of the video is the whole idea of solutions. I have an American accent and the speaker has an American accent. And I think maybe that's something that you would hear more in a North American context, that this is a problem with a solution, but it's not a once off. And we know that it's a lot trickier than just having a ready-made solution. So, you know, if the problem is that there are too many emissions that cause climate change, the solution would be to cut carbon, and how radically you do that and how you do that becomes more of the question. So some of you may have seen a book that came out last year called Pluriverse, which is a post-development approach applied to the climate. So the question of approaches and ways or solutions that are more reformist and solutions that are more transformative or require systemic change. Okay, just as a last sort of series of ideas before we start our lineup, the first one has to do with action. Action working within the system, climate action. So individuals, organizations change behavior. They look at technical interventions or interventions around renewables, green economy, smart cities, smart agriculture. There are issues about regulation, about incentives, policy engagement, both at a city level. We'll hear about some initiatives, for example, in Johannesburg, and also at a country level through COP, the Conference of Parties, the UNFCCC, cutting emissions, setting targets. You've all heard about the Paris Agreement. So that whole range of activities as climate action, requiring improved leadership and pushing corporations to become more green. Then the other response, and as usual, making this an either or can be quite problematic, but another response is more a response of climate justice. A climate justice response says, no, we need transformation, we need systemic change. And we have two speakers in particular who will be speaking about climate justice. That the reason we have the climate crisis is actually capitalism, and it requires systemic change in the economic structures and with elites that are government aligned, often with corporations. We need to change that in order to address many of the causes of excessive emissions and move to zero emissions. Okay, that was a mouthful. So basically, this webinar will be discussing the different approaches and actions from the perspectives and the experiences of different youth leaders. Today in our participants, which are now 115, thank you and welcome to everyone. We have a range of organizations, not just universities, but high schools or secondary schools, NGOs, grassroots activists, across the board organizations, range of ages. It's targeted with youth leaders, but we have people of all ages and people with different experiences that they can bring and that you can bring to the table. So I wanted to ask, we're hoping to have a lot of discussion right now. You cannot participate in the chat, but it's open and you can use the question and answer also as a chat. I see that one of the participants has posted quite lengthy text that you can all engage with as we go along if you like. And you're welcome to post resources or other things as I suggested. But when we get into the discussion, I will be facilitating, but please try to respect that some people are starting out as one of their first entrances into these sorts of discussions, and others have been working in this area for decades. So we hope to have a chat where we can put a lot of things on the table and get the discussion going. Right now, if there are no questions, and I don't see them in the chat or in the question answer, please let me hand over to Bright Nkrumah. First, he will be speaking about education, and then we'll have two other speakers, and with a chance to discuss in between. Kulakani, Trusha, and Dominic, welcome all of you. Starting with Bright. Bright will be talking about climate education and youth empowerment. He's affiliated with the Global Change Institute at WITS. He received his DPhil from the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, and he's published extensively on political contestation, minority rights, food insecurity, climate change, mobilization, and democratization. Welcome, Bright. We'll we'll give you about 10 minutes to get us going on this whole question of the role of the youth and how we can really get that going. Over to you.
Prof, who's bright? I didn't give them right. Who's that?
Oh no, sorry, it's Bright in Nkrumah. Like the Nkrumah in Ghana.
I don't see the name.
Okay, but as we sort that out, Khulekani, you are talking about the importance of youth and policy engagement. Khulekani is from Durban. He's the former Secretary General and the national team leader of the South African Youth Climate Change Coalition and the former bottom line team member of the youth constituency of the UNFCCC. He's currently working with churches and faith-based organizations, and he's a national representative on the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, PACJA. His social activism started in 2013, and he started focusing on climate justice in 2016. He has a diploma in theological studies. I think that's useful, Khulekani. We can always pray, hey? Let me hand over to you, and in the meantime, we'll get Bright on the line as well.
Right.
So
Thank
you
very
have 30
much.
minutes, but you can make it shorter if you like.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Prof. Mary, and greetings to everyone. Let me first start by appreciating the invitation to participate in this webinar on this very important initiative, which is Solve the Climate by 2030. 2 years ago, I attended a conference of the UN Environment Assembly in Nairobi, which delivered, among other things, a report that outlined that the world is nowhere near achieving the Agenda 2030, and that the world is nowhere near protecting the people by 2030. The world is nowhere near protecting the planet by 2030. The world is nowhere near protecting biodiversity loss by 2030. So this is, for me, a very good initiative that I am participating in here. So around that time, 2 years ago, we all heard that from the media, especially, that South Africa was almost failing to fully deliver on its national development plan. And at that very same context, we know very much that South Africa was nowhere near meeting the climate change ambition, particularly the qualitative goal of the climate action, which is meeting the 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius at least by 2030 or by 2050. I've been involved in various policy engagement with a group of young people to try and raise the voices and campaign for climate justice. In this talk, so I'm going to talk about my experience in climate policy engagement, and I will raise some suggestions in tackling this crisis. I have been informed about climate change since I was in high school, but I've never been very much conscientized about it as a matter of justice and as a matter of emergency. In November 2017, I attended a climate change conference in Morocco under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. I was particularly interested in the topic of capacity building and education. The one thing which made me to even want to be a climate justice activist, it was when policymakers in one of the negotiations during the conference had to exhaust 2 days discussing 2 words, whether they should put the word should or they should put the word shall in a text. It didn't make sense to me. The only thing that made sense to me was that action needs to happen and whether we put the word should or whether we put the word shall, action needs to happen and everyone will do the action. But few years later, the importance of the words in policies have made much more sense to me, especially about how some governments and corporates avoid being accountable through weakening policies with non-binding words such as should, would, may, and by noting some scientific reports instead of welcoming them or acknowledging them. So I have observed various processes where leaders are determined for action, but not making enough and effective progress. And these leaders are mostly the adult. One of the needs for climate action is to do justice for the future generations and the unborn generation, who would most likely face dire consequences of the climate crisis, which they are not responsible for. And one of the projects that I've worked on was about studying the legislative progress of the South African provinces on climate action and the seriousness of accounting for Section 24 of the South African Constitution. I did particularly the legislatures of KwaZulu-Natal, Gauteng, and Western Cape. One of the major things that we identified was the lack of seriousness of provinces on environmental and climate issues, and that issues do not have the same prominence among the issues that are dealt with by policymakers in the legislatures. So for instance, the KwaZulu-Natal province has a climate change response plan, which was already prepared and presented for the legislature in 2014, yet it has never been seen, it was never been tabled for parliament and for discussion. And there are municipalities who, as a result of provinces not taking serious action, are also lacking seriousness in their developmental plans. At least the eThekwini municipality has recently launched a new policy, the Durban Climate Action, which we are still studying. But we now know that it lacks enough participation from the public and from the civil society, which is one of the pillars of democracy and human rights. So on the question of why is it important for youth to participate and engage in policy processes or in policy engagement? And the answer to that is that it is a matter of justice. It's a matter of climate justice. And our definition of climate justice, which we submitted for a joint publication with the ACT Alliance, a group of faith-based organizations, on the definition of climate justice, we said that climate justice is the term that frames climate change as an ethical and political issue. It links climate policies to human rights and sustainable development, safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable people and sharing the burdens and benefits of climate change and climate policies equally and fairly. It also refers to intergenerational equity and the full, equal, and meaningful participation of youth in all climate-related processes, platforms, and actions. It refers to striving for environmental justice, justice to nature, gender equality, and the protection and promotion of human rights for all. It also encompassing of the voices of indigenous people, access to sustainable energy for all, and a just transition for those whose jobs or livelihood are threatened by ambitious climate policies. So unfortunately, technically speaking, and for the purpose of this initiative, climate justice can be separated from climate action by definition. Climate action refers to achieving carbon neutrality, climate resilience, and leaving no one behind. Today, we have the climate crisis because we are nowhere near achieving climate justice or fully committing to climate action, to carbon neutrality, resilience, by creating a resilient society in the face of the crisis and leaving no one behind. The climate crisis has created, in many cases, has worsened in many cases the social ills that our society faces today. Poverty, unemployment, drought, economic stresses, displacement, migration, loss of properties, and loss of biodiversity. There are too many species that are facing extinction because of lack of climate action. We are currently facing a global health pandemic on top of this crisis, which a report from Groundwork and Greenpeace NGOs few years ago found that greenhouse gas emissions in one province, Mpumalanga, are responsible for an enormous amount of hospital admissions for breathing illnesses. And if you think about that, you can already see how climate crisis cannot be separated from everything that we are facing in the society today, including the health pandemic that we are facing. But one of the most critical things that have ever happened, which also needs more attention, is the inequalities that have been created by the climate crisis. In July 2019, I met Dr. Marshas or Dr. Matthews. I'm sorry if maybe I'm mistaking his name. He used to be a senior lecturer at the University of Western Cape. So we attended a conference together in Pretoria, where he presented a paper, in a conference. And some of his conclusions from a paper, he found that students who study in areas where the heat reaches 34 to 40 degrees Celsius are more likely to drop from schools than the ones who study in well-equipped facilities that have, for instance, air conditioners. And he found that young people who studied in areas where the heat from global warming reaches 35 to 40 degrees Celsius in a day or for as long as a week or weeks without proper schooling facilities are less competitive in securing university spaces than those who had the opposite situation. Now, this is to me an evidence of the inequality that this climate crisis has created. And judging from my experience, I believe that this is happening with the kids that are in rural areas. And perhaps that is why many young people are migrating to urban areas. The rural population has been decreasing every year, notably by 7% in 2017, by 13% in 2018, by 16% in 2019. And that is not related to urbanization. It's related to internal migration, where people are flooding into cities for better lives and for better treatments, which now leads me to my next topic of inequality. Some communities are seemingly more important than other communities regarding responses to climate change effects. I remember in 2015, for instance, an intergovernmental task force which was formed by the government found that 5 provinces in South Africa were already suffering from drought and were water stressed. But the Western Cape was not one of them. It was the Northwest KwaZulu-Natal, Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and the Free State. But 3 years later, in 2018, when the government announced that Western Cape has also joined these provinces and that Cape Town was nearing water zero, and the whole nation and the world woke up and stood up, messages of solidarity and support donations were organized all over. I live in Durban, Northern, and from around 2009, we never had water for more than 14 hours a day. Most of the times we would have running water in the taps from 4 a.m. to between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. Sometimes we would not have water for a week or for weeks. In 2015, when I was a theology student, I used to travel to rural areas in KZN, Eshowe, Melmoth, Mtuba, and various other places. And I was doing my practicals. And in many places, then we find that the dams were empty, the rivers were empty. Even the streams, they were dry. They were dry lands. And I experienced that during my I experienced that during my travel. So this whole situation where one community is treated differently from other communities when it comes to responding to climate effect is another evidence for me that this climate crisis has also created the inequalities. But one of the solutions that we have presented as a community is water recycling. We need to be able to save water, but there are various issues that are often presented back to us, such as the issue of storage and issues around fixing leaking water pipes, especially in informal residential areas. Water preservation and water recycling is a solution to our water-stressed communities, but people also need to be well informed and supported in their capacities equally and fairly. And today, as we mark World Health Day, we should commit to the theme of building a fairer and healthier world for all. Now, in my conclusion, I was also happy about this initiative of solving the climate by 2030, because one of the things that I envisioned when I started to be interested in capacity building and education in my early stages in the climate processes was for climate change or climate solutions to be made a curriculum for basic learning and for higher learning assignment for all students. And it's one of the things that I said in one media interview that I did when I was in a conference in Morocco. Dr. Eben, in the introductory video of this initiative, asked a question, if we can make climate a class. And I'm saying, absolutely. It is in the classrooms that ideas are produced and tested, and through dialogues and debate. Young people in universities are a network with a rooted presence at the national and community level. This network has a competitive advantage as innovators, influencers, connectors, and implementers of climate policy and actions. College and university students can play an active role in ambitious climate action by serving as a moral compass for implementing the nationally determined contributions and other climate policies. Students and all youth in all communities can raise the voice of climate vulnerable people and communities and ensure their full and meaningful participation. At colleges and universities, we have time to think and we have time to research and to challenge our findings. When we go back to the communities, we have skills and knowledge to implement. Now, for a practical action that we can take ourselves, we can either join an existing initiative or start our own initiative. But the important thing to know is that it is important to not work in isolation. For instance, here in South Africa, we have various climate change networks. We have the National Climate Justice Coalition. We have the South African Climate Action Network. And then we have the African Climate Initiative, which is, I think, based in Cape Town. And for people who are for religious people, we have, for instance, SAFSE, Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute. And there are many other initiatives that we can join in order for us to do the action, not in isolation. Now, a network of universities have created this particular initiative, and it's a strong one because they are not in silos. Fellow young climate activists that we know have not been working alone. We have been supporting them. When Timothy, a young man from Fiji in the Pacific Islands, addressed the world leaders at the United Nations in 2017, we were there in person to support him. And when Greta Thunberg also addressed the UN state representatives for the first time in 2018, we were also there to support her. And both Vanessa and Ayaka, Vanessa is from Uganda, Ayaka is here in Cape Town, and many other young climate activists, they have our support. The current chairperson of the UN Secretary General Youth Climate Group chairperson, who is the chair, is from Sudan, and we've been working with her, especially in the processes that are focusing in the continent of Africa. So one of the campaigns that we are working on is to support, like internationally, is to support. I'm sorry, we have chickens in my yard, so sorry about this singing. So the one of the campaigns that we are working with, and that I would like to encourage, especially students, to actually maybe join if they are interested, is the one that encourages world leaders or member states in the United Nations to support the notion to get the International Court of Justice to deal with the question of climate change legality. And this initiative was started in 2012, and it continues to be a campaign that is even supported by other countries. So we are currently working on updating a report from the Yale University. So the Yale University published a report on climate change and International Court of Justice. We are currently updating the content of that report because there have been recent reports, especially scientific reports, that need to be integrated in the report to actually make sure that our campaign is accurate enough for this campaign. So if there are people that are interested in this campaign, I can send more information and the link on how to join. You can join as a friend of the initiative. You can join directly into it as an academic or as an aspirant academic, as a student as well. I will share that with you. So thank you very much. This is my talk to you. Thank you for listening to me.
Thanks so much, Khulekani. We've had some questions coming up in the chat as we go along, and some of these I'll read out, and then other people who would like to speak, you can raise your hand and we will be able to recognize you. We had one question, and then others can also respond, about universities disinvesting from fossil fuel industry. And I responded suggesting that what is the pressure on these universities? There's been pressure on overseas universities who have then divested. Has there been an effort in South Africa to put pressure on universities? Another question here, I think you can all see them, is about how, and Khulekani, I'd love to hear what you would respond to this. There's a huge housing problem, and then you could also add to it other basic needs, water, sanitation. Wait, those are much more important. Shouldn't we help people first and then help the environment? So that's just a direct question in the South African context. I think Khulekani talked about how climate exacerbates existing problems and social ills. And so that question about resilience and action, we'll hear his response. And let me read out one more. How do we make it more personal? There are a lot of resources out there, but it's only a trendy thing when people are talking about it. It's how do we make people really realize that they need to take this up? So I think both of those questions, Khulekani, are coming at it the same way. like from where people are starting from in South Africa. How do you get through to indicate the importance of this climate action to make it real? And I'm not expecting that you're going to have the answer to this, because I think we're all grappling with it, but would love to hear your response.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mary. I'm sorry that I cannot see the chat now. I'm skeptical of disturbing my my gadget. On the question of, because we have many issues, and how do we make climate more of a serious issue? This is one of the things that we found when we studied the provinces, especially the province of KwaZulu-Natal, Gauteng, and Western Cape, that there are too many issues that we are dealing with, both as maybe as government and as communities, and that climate change itself is not a prominent issue. And to make it a prominent issue, or to make it an important issue as much as we have other issues, I think it's just simple. We should plan ahead, because the issues that we're having, for instance, the issues of housing, the issues of lack of access to water, lack of access to energy, are short-term issues. But then if you look at climate change is always there, and it will be there for the longest term. In July 2019, if not 2018, I attended the SOPA in KZN, at the state of the province address. The Premier announced that the climate change events that have taken place in KZN in a space of 6 months have costed the province more than 1 billion rand. Only the climate change effect. And then I think in the following year, or few months later, there were also heavy rains in KZN, which destroyed many properties, and the province had to also pay the cost of the damage. So you see that if maybe we don't invest in climate action, we'll always, in one way or the other, do something about it. We will be exhausted, especially our resources. So it's something that when we are dealing with other issues, we need to, I mean, if we're talking about climate action, we also need to accompany it in everything that we are doing. That is why we also talk about intersectoral plans when you talk about climate change. For instance, like all departments and all divisions in the government should also have a climate change response plan, because you can plan something now for maybe to be completed in 2022, but that might not be completed because we don't know what the climate would look like. But the science tells us that it will be worse than that. So I think that would be my response to that. So how do we make this more personal? I think we make this personal by, I mean, if you want to start taking action, we must do, I mean, practical activities like recycling, you know, and then maybe at the university levels, this is where we need to start to initiate things like dialogues, intergenerational dialogues, and yeah, but dialogues, I think they are important, because the first thing that they do, they change the narrative. And if they change the narrative, this is when change can happen. I think maybe that's how we can make it more. It was during theology, an assignment, there would always be a part where your fellow colleagues are challenging you. You know, they are just debating you. They're not debating you because maybe they hate you or they criticize you, but they debate you because they want to deepen the knowledge that you have, you know. So I think maybe if we can have the dialogues as many as we should, I think in that way we can change the narrative And by changing the narrative, we can change the world.
Fantastic. Thanks, Khulekani. I'm keeping a side note of different suggestions that have come up so we can come back to those as we go along. Bright is now with us, but before we move on to Bright, I would like to give just a couple minutes to one of our other backup panelists, Tyler Booth, who's from the South African Institute for International Affairs, because Tyler has been doing a lot of work with the city of Johannesburg and also linking with the Conference of Parties. She and others, Khulekani's different initiatives, they all work in conjunction with each other toward this, toward the shared aim. Khulekani, did you want to say something else? Or otherwise, won't you please mute? I think you're not muted. Tyler, can I give you a chance? Not too long, because we'll run out of time, but please go ahead.
Please go ahead. Yes, great. Thank you for the introduction and having me join. So I'm a bit more information of the organization and the grouping I'm with. I'm with the Youth Policy Committee. I'm the focal point for that, and basically our focus, I think Khulekani also mentioned it, is looking at policy and engaging young people in policy making processes. So I'm part of the climate change working group. And then I'm also working as one of the younger contact points for the NDC working group and trying to raise ambition, setting up a few different projects or webinars, getting young people involved in the NDC process. So I'd like to share a bit more of information of some of our current projects, or one we did last year. So firstly, I'd like to tell you about the Youth Climate Advocacy in Africa report. I see there was actually a question that popped up about how scientists are engaging young people, how academics are engaging young people in research. So this project was run by the South African Institute of International Affairs. And then they brought on junior researchers, myself being one of them. I think there were about 6 junior researchers, where the objective was to investigate the climate policies in a specific country in Africa. So the case example I looked at was Ethiopia, and looking about how they included in the country's national delegations, and also what sort of networks are occurring in the country and how these engagements happen. In terms of the South African context, we also do have youth delegates to the COP. I was fortunate to be one of them for COP25, and actually in that year we had 3 youth COP delegates, and all happened to be women. And the theme that 2 of us looked at or followed the negotiations and were the official negotiators were looking at gender mainstreaming, and we worked on the Lima Work Program and the It's Gender Action Plan. But more of our youth-specific work that we've done at a local level and now moving on to a national level is a thing we've called the Youth Climate Action Plan. And I believe Bright might touch on this a bit, because fortunately with the Global Change Institute, supported by Prof. Colleen Vogel, we were able to work with the city of Joburg and provide an official youth input into the document, but not in the sense that our comments were taken up and simply included. We were able to write a whole section in the document that's written by youth, for government, for various different stakeholders. So it's basically a legally binding version of what young people want to happen in terms of the city of Joburg. So I'll just highlight some of the principles we've looked at. So we looked at intersectionality and looking at community focus, looked at education, and that education is not only formal but informal at the same time, and that we realized that while curriculum changes and curriculum additions are very important, we also realize that we've got a large proportion of uneducated people, illiterate people, without access to resources like joining a Zoom webinar. So we realized that other sorts of informal education also needs to occur. Then we looked at systemic change and good governance, and how we manage our waste, but also how government and business are held accountable for their actions. We looked at the just transition. We looked at innovation and how technology is very important. Then we looked at leadership and advocacy and encouraging government to take up more youth leadership positions and making the youth parliaments actually have value in national, regional, or municipal parliaments. And then finally, under that, we looked at accessibility and sustainability. So that's the key principles. We looked at the Joburg Youth Climate Action Plan, which features in the Joburg's Climate Action Plan, and that will be released, I think, on the 21st of April this month. And then in terms of a national process, we've actually just started the rollout. I'm one of the national coordinators for this process, being the Youth Climate Action Plan. So this is a more national level of the Joburg YCAP. That was obviously more of a pilot project, but the YCAP is basically going to serve as not only our input for AIDCs or future engagements we hold with government or business leaders or other NGOs. It's going to serve as a basis for what we as young people want to happen in all sectors of climate action in the country. And we're not limiting it to only social justice. We're also seeing that social justice goes beyond in just environmental action. So we're seeing a whole lot of different things coming through. Some of the principles, we've basically just started the process. We've had our first meeting. We're open to have more people join the process. I can drop the link in the chat box for more people, young people, if they're interested in joining. We'll be having our next meeting, national meeting, on the 24th of April. But some of the principles we're looking at the moment is intersectionality again, accountability, climate curriculum, renewable and sustainable energy, sustainable urban development, and under that, obviously, food security, water security, agriculture. Then we're looking at inclusive governance, waste management, and knowledge systems in terms of how do we make use of local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and scientific knowledge in furthering climate action. So thank you for letting me share. That's some of the work we're doing at the moment. But yeah, I'm open to questions, and I'll drop the link in the chat for people to get involved.
Most of them are relevant to Bright's presentation about primary and secondary playing a bigger role, and about what role research
Prof. Mary's having a connectivity issue. Maybe whilst she's still sorting herself out, Sandile, can you make your comment?
Okay, thanks for Kulugane for the good presentation you've just presented. And to Tyler, I hear there's a lot of good work that you have done, but then my question is around the issue of, as much as these contributions and these engagements with local municipalities and the mega cities, you are contributing. But my challenge is on the implementation side of things. Who does the monitoring of these contributions that you are talking to, that you are putting through within the government's legislation? Because I live in in a township of Guatemala, and when you look at programs that are taking place, there are programs that are not even closer to climate resilient. So how do we take action around making sure and monitoring?
Great. I think I'll answer that. So in terms of the Youth Climate Action Plan, we're actually working on an implementation plan alongside, and we're specifically kicking off the Joburg Youth Climate Action Plan's implementation plan this week, Friday, and visualizing how we want that to be kicked off. So that's what we're doing from the youth side, but that's also something we advocate for, and we're trying to follow up with government. As young people, we're trying to lobby our voice, because right now, the global climate is listening to young voices. Thanks to the movement by Greta Thunberg, we're being taken more seriously and not so tokenistically as we previously were when we engage with government leaders. But there is still a challenge, and a challenge in manpower and actual capacity at multiple levels. That's my opinion, of taking up these policies. And I think one of the greatest challenges we do face right now, we have great policies, and the Paris Agreement is a really good document, but right now we're not implementing it, and that 10 years is already now 9 years. So I definitely think that's something we can take up, and that's probably a very good market for young people to force their way into, is how do we monitor these policies? How do we ensure they're actually being implemented as they say they're being implemented, and are they actually making the difference they're supposed to be making?
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Tyler. Bright, do you want to carry on?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much, Mary. And then my apologies for actually coming in late. We had another session with youth from Zimbabwe where we were actually discussing climate change and its impact on health issues. Myself and Prof. Colleen and others. So my apologies. It actually breaks my heart that I couldn't listen to your Just Transition presentation, and as well as that of our colleague Kani. I really wanted to actually pick some pieces just to connect to my discussion. But let me just first of all begin to say that it's not often that as academics, which I mean students, teachers, and lecturers, that we do get opportunities to actually to sit back and reflect on our role within the climate justice struggle. It's rare. It's not so. It's not common. That is why at this point in time, I think the organizers of this conference did a noble deed of actually putting this agenda, this topic on the agenda. And the question is that why is education so important in this particular discussion? Should we focus on education? And perhaps maybe there are three incentives. Number one is that the classrooms is actually one platform, is one of the very few platforms where you can have a topic like climate change reach many audience within this context, student and youth. Also, one of the fundamental traits of education is that it seeks to groom leaders and to groom young people who will keep checks on those in power, and also who eventually also evolve and become those leaders themselves, and to that extent by becoming policy makers in themselves. And also education also forms part of the good governance structure. So to that end, the teachers, lecturers, and students are often, you have policymakers who often seek these actors out for consultation purposes to actually guide them in their decision-making processes. And this leads us to ask ourselves one fundamental question as academics, as students and teachers and lecturers. Have we done enough to actually promote or to advance issues around climate change? And if you look at the landscape of the educational sector in the country and as well as across the African continent, you can see there are three particular patterns. You have number one, institutions which are actually dedicated to the climate justice struggle. For instance, you have Mary, who is doing an excellent work. You have the global GCI. You have Tyler from SIA, and of course, AIDC. You have these institutions which are actually playing very pivotal role within this industry. The second cluster of institutions you see are those who the well-intentioned institutions, those who seek to promote some form of a climate justice initiative. So to that, within this institution, to some extent, climate change remains on the periphery. So it becomes a form of a major subject to be chosen by those who are interested in environmental sciences, or it becomes a master's program to be pursued by those in the biophysical sciences. And then the third layer are those who have not evolved or those who are not organic to climate discussions. Within these institutions, it's rare for you to find climate change as a module within these institutions. I wouldn't want to go into my details because of for lack of time. And then when you look at all these three clusters of institutions and the lack of awareness around climate issues in the streets, and then within the policy circles, it is obvious that the third and the second clusters, their effort or their lack of effort seems to overshadow that of the first camp. And then so you have a lot of policymakers, a lot of decision makers, a lot of opinion leaders who lack knowledge about climate change, and this is actually it negates efforts towards promoting or mitigating climate change. This leads us to one fundamental question as to how do you cross this bridge? How do you overcome this challenge? And I table 6 recommendations. Number 1 is adopting a cross-disciplinary approach to climate change. The conventional notion is that climate change is often something which is within the physical sciences alone. To that extent, those who are actually within political science and archaeology don't have to be much concerned about climate change. But we need to overcome. We need to actually jump this bridge. There is a need for climate change to be infused within the different sectors of syllabus. Therefore, maybe researchers and as well as the drafters of basic, from secondary, not just secondary, even going down to the lower grades, also need to consider the issue of climate change. The second recommendation is that we need to cross the bridge of abstract concept around climate change. In most often times, discussions around climate change evolve around complex terminologies, often very convoluted, adopting words which many people often do not actually understand. And I reckon not long ago, I went to visit my old mother in the village. And when I got there, she asked me, "My son, what are you doing in the big city?" I said, "No, I'm working around them. I'm a climate activist." He said, "What is that?" Then the local teacher who happens to, we consider him to be the elite within the village, said, "Oh, he's one of those tree huggers. Can't you see that he's always bald? That's why his hair never grows." Those who are always saying the world is going to collapse because we are cutting trees. So within that context, you need to now come down and break it down so that ordinary people, the ordinary teacher himself can actually understand what you mean by saying, by speaking about climate change. Then my old mother asked me, "So if you say we must stop burning using firewood, what do you suggest?" And that brings in the issue of Mary's discussion, just transition. You are asking us to move from this to what end? Where do we go from here? So we need to actually have these basic principles, integrate them within our discussion. If we actually seek, or we actually seek to want to make progress within this sector. And also, the fourth recommendation is that we need to actually start climate education from the formative years of children. It is observed that between 0 to 8 years is the formative stages of children where they actually have a rapid cognitive development. So if we seek to actually inculcate the habit of children learning how to plant trees, learning how to not to abuse electricity, not maybe to actually support effort towards climate and emissions, we need to actually start it from the early stage, early age, rather than waiting for them to get to high school or university for us to now come and drum the beat of climate change into their heads. It will be very difficult for a considerable proportion of them to actually adapt or to understand what you're actually speaking about. And also, there's a need for us to connect learning to the lived experience, this daily struggle of individuals. That is, in most cases, climate change seems to stand alone, whereas the daily struggle, the daily lives of people seems to be somewhere else. We need to now start integrating the issue of why is milk so much, why are food so much expensive these days? One needs to actually make the link for people to actually understand why we actually speaking about climate change and its impact in contemporary times. And also the final recommendation would be that universities, primary schools, high schools need to lead by example. We are actually preaching about climate change, but as Mary, I think initial conversation, but how many of the institutions have actually moved towards mitigating itself? How many have actually considered harvesting rainwater? How many have actually considered shifting to solar energy? Because once society always looks up to the educational institution for guidance. So once the institutions actually move towards these mechanisms, it will inspire others down the line to actually inculcate or actually adapt this practice. Permit me to stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bright. You've put some new issues on the agenda, so we're getting a growing picture of the broader topic. Bright, I was just really curious about your reflecting people's daily structures and other people mentioning that community members need to understand climate change, because overseas we hear a lot about putting pressure on middle-class people to change their lifestyles, to take action so that they're not responsible for such huge carbon emissions. An American who has 3 refrigerators and keeps the air conditioning on. And we're not really talking about that for the mass of South African people. So in terms of involving people, aren't we equally trying to involve people to understand, not just for mitigation, but so that they're able to take steps to anticipate and adapt to the climate changes that we're certain to experience? Because even though normal run-of-the-people in South Africa, community members, aren't the big emitters, we in Africa will feel the impacts of climate change most acutely. So I'm just adding that question to the mix. There are some other comments that are coming in, but go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mary. Let me just be frank about this one. And when you speak of climate change, as you said, in most cases, as Africans, we emit less, but we stand to suffer more. So that brings in the barrier or the issue of racial, what you call regional discrimination aspect. That those who actually emit it more have the capacity to adapt. And then when you come down to, if you should bring it down to the local level in South Africa, those who are actually emitting less are the ones who are going to suffer more. So for instance, those in Soweto or those in Guyana, they emit less, but then ultimately they are going to suffer more. And if you are speaking of adaptation, it means that in future, what their coping strategy now, is it going to carry them into the future? Will they be able to cope in the next 30 years? And the question is, most of them will not be able to, simply because, for instance, they do not have the money to afford air conditioning to contain the enormous heat which they have to bear. Most of them will not have the money to actually afford the food hikes, which is going to occur over the next three decades. Most of them are going to be compelled to move from their location in Diani or from Alex to go into urban towns in order to go and look for jobs, for places to live, because the amount of their system of dependence, which is the land where they cultivate their crops, is not going to produce any yield anymore. So the question is, when we speak of strategies or tactics of mitigating, we must first of all speak to how should we cut down on emissions before we can speak of adaptation. Because the question, when you speak of adaptation, many will not be able to adapt because they do not have the needed resources, the capacities to adapt. But when you speak of mitigation, they can play some considerable role. And that's why there's a need that, for instance, and in some way, I discussed the issue of electricity usage, that how often do we actually encourage people to take shorter showers? How often do we encourage people to unplug gadgets which we are not using? How often do we actually engage and encourage people to go into recycling, simply because if you do not do this, this is what is going to happen to you over the next 30 years. And of course, once there is a notion that doomsayers, or once you propose this doom, people tend to throw in the towel and say, yes, no, there is nothing I can do. But the question is, at least if the person is aware, he might take some action towards it, to some degree. So it's a very different ballgame. Ultimately, we cannot control the actions of those in the US, but we can, to some extent, encourage those at our local level. So I think we must first of all, as they say, charity begins at home. Let's look at ourselves, and even when you come down to South Africa is a leading emitter, the highest emitter on the African continent, and most of these emissions are coming from electricity usage, from the coals which is being used by ESCOM. So the question is, the lesser electricity people use, the more chances of cutting down on this coal usage or the emission or its possible emission. So let's look at ourselves first before we can actually go and let's take out the speck from our eyes before we can actually go and speak to those in the US and elsewhere.
Thanks, Bright. I think that's a really good segue into the next speaker, because you've moved us from talking also about individual action and energy usage into like who is responsible for all these huge emissions that put South Africa on the toward the top of the list with emitters. And I think in terms of social justice, we'll hear more what's going on, climate justice, what's going on from the other speakers. This webinar is meant to raise issues that will lead us to further discussions outside of the webinar. And that has just raised all sorts of issues about mitigation versus adaptation, mitigation with adaptation, the role of community members, etc. So let's carry on. I want to keep this webinar moving. Patrick Bond has made a comment. Patrick, I'd like to put that on hold until we move on for the climate justice discussion. If you don't mind, I'll raise that in the next space for discussion. We'll carry on with Trusha Reddy, who's going to speak about building a progressive feminist African climate justice movement. Trusha Reddy is the head of energy and climate justice at Womin African Alliance. She's been a climate justice activist for over 15 years and has a master's degree in political studies from UKZN and a Bachelor of Journalism from Rhodes University. Welcome, Trusha. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm sure you must be quite tired by now, but thank you so much for the invite. To speak at this really important event. I think it's super important for us to be engaging who I think are mostly youth, a time that I'm well past, but a lot of university students, I hope, and learners from school as well, on what is, I guess, the defining issue of our time. And how we start engaging with it on a deeper level as well, and look at issues around climate justice as well. So I want to start with just sort of reflecting on sort of what happened from earlier this year and sort of the pretty desperate and dire situation that we had, which is not, and I'm not referring to COVID and the second wave that hit us from December into January in South Africa, but I'm actually referring to Cyclone Eloise that hit our southern east coast of Africa early this year. Many of you will remember the cyclone, not because of the cyclone itself, which mostly caused massive destruction to even, mostly Mozambique, but parts of Zimbabwe and South Africa as well. But most of us remember it because of the storms that we had as a result of it, as it was sort of decreasing in intensity throughout Feb. And so we had those what seemed like endless and really intense storms that hit us, causing lots of flooding and destruction of infrastructure, and even a few deaths in South Africa. Of course, there was, as I was alluding to, a lot more destruction in Mozambique, and there was a fair amount of destruction in Zimbabwe as well. But this isn't the first cyclone to have hit the southern east coast. In fact, in early 2019, if you can recall, it was only, I guess, a year and a half or a little bit more back in time, Cyclone Idai had hit the same coast, and it was incredibly destructive and incredibly intense, caused thousands of deaths, particularly in Mozambique, and left hundreds of thousands pretty destitute and many of them left in refugee camps. What you might not know and what you might not recall, which is actually something that I learned recently, is that there've actually been, since Idai to Eloise early this year, there've been 5 cyclones that have hit the same coast. 5. And in pretty short a time period, I would say. I mean, it's left people who were kept in refugee camps as a result of being displaced from their homes, sort of in new refugee camps, so they had to move or those camps were sort of were destroyed. Some people, new homes were starting to be built and they were destroyed again. So pretty dire situation. And then I think what's more distressing when you really hear about the depth of the problem there is that scientists are now saying that IDAI, for example, can be very conclusively linked to the climate crisis. So they're saying that the cyclone is not just a normal natural disaster, as it's usually being called, but it's specifically and explicitly connected to the climate crisis, as in it's a result of a warming climate. Another important thing that they've discovered is that the Indian Ocean is actually warming very fast. In fact, it's warming faster than any of the other oceans across the world. And it is this warming of the ocean that is creating these cyclones and will go on to create more and more cyclones as the ocean keeps heating. And so what we're talking about is a permanent, near permanent state of affairs, or a perpetual sense of crisis in this region. This is, of course, just sort of one instance of climate crisis and obviously of so-called natural disasters linked to a state of constant state of, and perpetual state of disaster in one part of the region. But all across Africa, there's many examples, including particularly in South Africa as well, on this. So essentially what we're facing is, which is the prediction that sort of happened a while ago by scientists, but now is sort of, we're living in that reality, is that we will, as I said, be living in a perpetual state of crisis or disaster as a result of climate change and climate impacts, particularly, as other speakers have said, which impact most on the most vulnerable, which is many people across South Africa and the whole region, because we have less ability to also have resilience and to be able to adapt to these crises. The other thing is that the state of debt in Mozambique has already been quite dire because from colonial times there's had been debt issues, which obviously Mozambique is still trying to pay. And then it's made worse by the fact that when disasters like these strike, you obviously, you get into more, these countries get into more debt, more and more debt, upon, which is put upon the other debt that they had already had, the sort of colonial debt. And so it also puts the state in a very vulnerable position as well to be able to tackle the changes. I mean, when these cyclones, particularly Idai, when it hit, I think it was around the same time that that famous Notre Dame, the church in France, was burning. And at the time that was burning, a couple of billionaires, some of you may know, sort of quickly injected some funds as a donation to repair Notre Dame. But nothing like that happened in Mozambique. They were forced to actually take on more loans. So funding was not given as it should be, as just support or donations to be able to just help people survive. In fact, it was it's outfits like the Gift of the Givers and so on, who actually came in and provided the most kind of and most effective, and freest, I guess, form of relief in the area. So I think what I'm pointing to, and sorry, there was one other thing that I think it's there's the PhD study on this, which is to be released. So maybe I'm sort of giving away some of the findings, but I thought this was also particularly helpful in us understanding the situation that we're in at the moment, which is that the cost of the disaster, the cost of Idai, is actually far more. It's, I think, something and the measure of 10 times more than any of the revenues that Mozambique would have earned from the gas projects or these extractive projects that it has in its territory. So all pretty startling, all pretty distressing facts to know, distressing in the sense of understanding the reality in which we live. I think some of you were talking about the fact that we have more important survival needs in South Africa that need to be taken care of before we can think of climate change. I think this kind of situation and sort of what we're seeing and the very real predictions that we're witnessing actually at the moment tells us a different story, that this is not some far off event. Climate change, climate impacts are not a far off event. And it's obviously intensifying and exacerbating existing issues of social and economic justice that people face. And so it cannot be separated. And so I wanted to just point to, I think the session is really supposed to head to, so what are the responses do we have then to solving climate change, which I think is a pretty dangerous word because it's, I don't think we're even in a mode of solving climate change. But we'll get to that. But in order to get to that, I think the next part of this is to just point to what I've just said now, the reflections on sort of what's actually going on in Africa, and point to what's instructive for us in this, which can then point to the responses that are needed. The first thing is that, which I've said a few times, which is, it looks like we are living now in a state of perpetual crisis, of in fact deepening crisis, and of intersecting crises. We know that with COVID intersects with climate as well as other economic, ecological, social crises are all intersecting at the same time, creating a new reality, a new normal for us. I mean, we're talking about it most profoundly in relation to COVID these days, and saying that we might never get to a stage where we are pandemic free. We don't know what other pathogens are going to be released into the atmosphere, particularly as ice sheets melt and they release, and the permafrost sort of releases new pathogens. We deforest even more, and the encroachment there of people into those spaces releases again more pathogens. And so that the COVID situation teaches us that this crisis, there's not going to be a return to normal as we knew it. And when we look at how the climate crisis is unfolding together with this crisis and others, as I said, we're looking at a situation, unfortunately, of just deepening crisis, particularly in a place like Africa. The second thing that I think all of this has instructing us on is this issue of extractivism. And I don't know to what extent you have an understanding about extractivism, which is basically rooted in a patriarchal, racist, capitalist society that we live in, which has caused the climate crisis, this massive extraction of resources at a rapid rate has actually caused and fueled the climate crisis and is intensifying the crisis. Right now in Mozambique, as we speak, there's increased gas extraction, for example, and coal extraction in an area that is already beleaguered by the climate crisis, and where when we see people facing the onslaught of both of these, of the extractivist industry and of the climate crisis. And it's happening in ways that are intersecting and compounding or exacerbating the crisis. I mean, we know about, and we all, I think, understand by now, the destructive fossil fuel industry, for example, which in fact is, sort of really taking off across Africa, particularly the oil and gas industry, and to some extent the coal industry. In new sacrifice zones, new parts of the world, new parts of Africa, which haven't been touched before, as compared to other places where, people have already been facing, in like places like the Niger Delta and so on, where they've already been facing the fallout from the oil industry there, together with climate impacts that are exacerbating. Women, of course, tend to be most vulnerable and most impacted, particularly across the African region, where the majority are sort of peasant farmers and are really tied to the land. And we call them stewards of nature, in fact, because they're sort of taking care of and in harmony with nature because of that harmonious sort of interplay and interrelationship with women and the sort of resources or natural resources that they consume for themselves and their community. So every time an extractivist project, a fossil fuel project, or whatever, any of those kinds of destructive projects come in, there's a grab of resources, and people are dislocated, particularly women who are peasant farmers, and they face the fallout from that. Plus, they face the fallout maybe put in new places where they are, which is a completely not inarable, or unable to. It's not fertile. You're not able to farm there because there's already been massive impact on the climate. Plus, there's less and less water resources, for example, in an area, and when they're captured by a destructive project, like a fossil fuel project, it means that there's less of it for women and their communities. But in a situation of climate change where there's less and less water resources as well, you can see how dire that interplay of issues can actually be on the lives and livelihoods of women and their community. The third thing is that I want to point to is South Africa, and I think a couple of the other speakers have pointed to this, is South Africa's role in the region. And South Africa has a particular role to play in almost fueling the climate crisis, if I can put it that crudely, because it has, since apartheid times and beyond into current times, invested in a lot of destructive projects across the region. Obviously, we know that, even in Mozambique, for example, Sasol, the petrochemical company, is extracting gas from the country and importing it into South Africa for South African consumers. Obviously, South African industry and elite consumers, not the poor, but that's South Africa's role in Mozambique. South Africa is also has invested in the Cahora Bassa Dam, a big hydroelectric dam, which it also imports electricity from the country into South Africa. And interestingly, when Idai hit, the transmission lines from Cahora Bassa Dam were actually knocked down. And so that was one of the times that we went into a load shedding mode into South Africa. But what role really does South Africa have and responsibility to take for its role in the region and for basically causing and exacerbating climate change in the region? That also needs to be looked at quite closely. Of course, there is a role as well for the global north, who have historically been responsible for climate change as well. And that leads me to the next point, which is the issue of climate debt. I think Bright before me, was talking about the fact that Africa has barely any contribution to climate change. It's about 2 to 3%, possibly excluding South Africa, which of course we know is a big climate criminal across the world, but and polluter, I should say, across the world. But for the most part, the African region has not caused climate change, but will face the most massive impacts. And we need to attribute responsibility in this regard, because again, if you look at the Mozambican situation, who should be paying for that? Should it be, I mean, the Mozambican people? Should it be the Mozambican government? I'm going to leave the issues of corruption and mismanagement aside, but I'm just looking at the debt issue. Should we be getting loans to be actually dealing with these climate-related disasters and so on, or climate adaptation and so on? Or should it be paid by those who actually caused the crisis itself? And that's an important political point. It's an important point of principle for the climate justice movement. And it's an important practical point as well, because we can't further indebt countries and people, basically subjecting them to a continued and deepening level of poverty and complete desperation if we still lock them into these horrible loans that are usually given by these international finance institutions like the World Bank and so on. And they all come with massive interest rates. They come with other kinds of conditionalities where states have to completely change their systems to be more open to these very extractive industries that are causing the harm in the countries, facilitating that kind of thing, facilitating the extraction of profit just for the hands of a few, for these transnational corporations, often which is illicitly transferred out of Africa as well. And so never gets to see the light of day, any of these revenues to people in Africa as well. And so we're looking then at the last point here, which is pointing to some of the responses as well, to the fact that, the solutions here, cannot be embedded in the same logic as which created the crisis itself. And so if we really, when we start looking at responses, we do, as I said, have to be instructed by this deeper understanding of the system in which we live. And I think Mary had sort of spoken to this quite clearly, that we have to look at root causes of these issues. So I want to speak very briefly about responses that are connected at a deeper level and are sort of multifaceted, but also don't talk about quick and easy technological fixes or solving climate by 2030, because I don't think that's actually helpful to the discussion, because what we need, if we really understand what's happening with the climate and ecological crises, is that the issues are at a much deeper level and involves a much deeper kind of change then. So the few things that I do want to talk about, and then I'll just sort of maybe quickly show you a list of principles which speak to that, which I think might just be helpful in sort of just explicating a little bit more. So as I was suggesting, when we're trying to address the climate and ecological crisis, looking at all of these issues, we must think about root causes. And a lot of our activism and work talks to that. It's about interrogating this development model that we are currently in, this patriarchal, capitalist, racist model, which is about increased profits for very few people. Everybody knows about the 1% who are getting richer and richer, even during the COVID crisis. Lots of disaster capitalism as well, which has nothing to do with actually solving any of the problems, but actually talks to increasing inequality, and as a result, increasing the depth at which some people feel exposed to things like the climate crisis. We're talking about root causes where there's this idea that some people can be sacrificed for this weird notion of development based on GDP and based on lots of profit by few. Why should some people be sacrificed? So this idea about sacrifice zones, for example. So some people, usually in areas where they're the most vulnerable, people who are actually peasants, particularly across the African region, peasant farmers and fishers and so on, who, when these projects come in, basically just cast aside, displaced from their lands, and regarded as just as irrelevant, and needing to sacrifice themselves for some kind of strange, bigger development goal. And all of this, of course, contributes to and intensifies the climate crisis. The second thing, which I have sort of spoken to when I was talking about sort of one of the key issues we should be instructed by, is the issue of climate debt. I've spoken quite a bit about it, but it is an issue of principle, but it is practically something that also has to be done. The global north, and I would include South Africa in this instance because of the harm that it has caused across the region, has to face and has to pay in quite real terms, in fact, as well, a climate debt to Africa in order to help the region to be able to sustain the impacts, to be able to build resilience, and so on. The other thing is, which we really underscore in all of the activism that we are part of and we support, is that resistance is key. We have to resist this idea of sacrifice zones or people who can be sacrificed. We have to support and help build a resistance that is in defense of people's land, in defense of nature, and against this really destructive kind of extractivism of the fossil fuel industry and so on. And also resistance against these so-called false solutions, which are touted as these so-called, like if we just implement these technological solutions like geoengineering and so on, we'll be able to solve the crisis. Or even saying that we have the renewable energy resource, and so we should just be switching from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And I think that there is a resistance that we need to build against that idea as well, particularly because it's embedded in this development model that still says it's being done, or this renewable energy is being built as large-scale renewable energy, and it's for an elite few who live in urban areas. It's for industry and and basically takes place within this bigger development model that I've been speaking about. So resistance needs to happen and is happening at different levels, and has to be part of the sort of dealing with the climate crisis. I do want to touch on this thing about policy processes, and I know it's quite controversial, but this whole UNFCCC process, the sort of COP, or the climate change negotiations, I do feel like we need to be quite critical of how we engage. I do think policy responses and our engagement as youth and activists and so on need to be engaged at a level where policies are changing and so on. But the space that we're talking about in the UNFCCC is quite a controversial and a contested space. It's a space of largely governments, as I think most of you know, but increasingly more and more so of big corporates. Those very corporates, like we said, are causing climate change. They are sitting at the table negotiating our futures. And governments, the governments that are there, and the lead governments that are pushing these really flawed policies, these really flawed sort of treaties on climate and so on, like the Paris Agreement, for example, they all have vested interests in sustaining this development model. And in Africa, of aspiring to this development model that is causing and deepening the climate crisis. So we do need to interrogate our engagement in these spaces. I think the other point around that is that there's a decreasing space as well over these 26 or something years of the climate negotiations for civil society and for those like the youth, for example. So while I still do believe that there is quite a large amount of tokenism that is still there, but I mean, I do applaud the efforts to still try and sort of have voices heard, to try and interject in other kinds of spaces and so on. But we should never try and substitute for the other kinds of things that we do in the service of climate justice, which, for example, is primarily resistance and addressing the root causes, which is talking about total transformation of our economies to really be able to deal with the problem. And as we all know, I think even what Solve Climate by 2030 will tell you that, it has to be done pretty urgently. So these responses need to be taken up pretty urgently. And I'll leave you with the last point, which is about, so I focused a lot about resistance to the status quo, resistance to the development model, etc. But there is a yes to all of this. And it is about looking at what are alternative development models that would be climate sensitive, that will be aiding the climate. And I think for that, we do need to listen to those peasant women farmers and listen to those who are on the front lines of climate change and front lines of these destructive, extractive industries, and really try and understand and build this bridge again and harmony with nature, and really see ourselves as human beings, as those who are a sort of part of nature and not those who are trying to just control and exploit nature, which is the history of human beings, and particular human beings, obviously in the global north and so on. But we need to understand that as well. So I just want to, and Mary's come on, because I assume she wants to move on. So sorry, Mary, I just want to share my screen just for a second. It's not, I can share it with you after as well, but just for now, so I'm sharing with you here. I think you have my screen. We are in the process of trying to, I would say, build or strengthen what we call a progressive African climate justice movement. And these are some of the principles which I've spoken to, that this sort of this movement, or this progressive sort of grouping that's coming together is built on. And there's 11 here. And I don't know how fast you can read, but I'm just going through because I can't show all of it at one time. And I'm happy to send that along as well. But that is sort of, I guess if you're thinking about just practically, it's just a way in which we are trying to sort of build convergence, build the collective around what we call this progressive climate justice sort of framing of things, and building from below with fishers, peasants, etc., on the ground who are most impacted. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Trisha. And can you cut and paste that and place it in the chat so that people can access the positions and demands that you just showed us? That would be great. A few points came up and they intersect with some discussion that's been happening in the chat box. Trusha, I'm not sure that you could multitask and see that discussion. but you described a deepening crisis. And I was wondering if we consider that also an opportunity for change. There's been discussion of eco-socialism possibly being something that there's scope for now that things are sort of unsettled, crisis as an opportunity for change. But two points came up that I wanted to highlight. Russell was raising the issue of whether climate becomes, and I think I've got it, Russell, you can correct me, whether climate becomes the sole focus almost in a siloed way. And how do we make sure that that then fits in, that fits into all the other discussions and all the other sectors, the whole issue of climate. I hope everyone can hear me. I just got a message, my internet is weak. So how do you make sure that when you talk about extractivism, you're also talking about water resources, you're also talking, it's all one and the same. Earlier, someone raised the issue of housing and housing relating to flooding and housing related to other concerns as well. The other point that was raised, Sandile raised processes and organizations that need to be held accountable. That turns into, okay, well, Trusha, you have put this list of demands, but and I know that there are strategies we need to all start to discuss, like not just what needs to change, but how are we going to get there? What are the levers for change? And we're hoping that some of the things that have been raised in further discussion will get us there too. What are the ways to hold groups accountable to who are we targeting? Someone raised university disinvestment, someone raised an intergenerational dialogue to start changing the narrative. Where do we go with that? Anyway, we're running just a few minutes behind time, although we've had a stunning timekeeper here. Dominic, do you want to carry on? And then we can conclude with a final discussion when you're done. Dominic is talking about the interplay or the intersecting economic and ecological crises, as you can see. He works at the Alternative Information and Development Center in Cape Town. He's worked there since 2015. It's an activist think tank that was established in 1996 in support of worker struggles and social movements for economic, social, and environmental justice. So you see they're all interwoven. At AIDC, Dominic coordinates the Economic Justice Program, undertaking political economy research and facilitating popular education. We need to hear more about that, and trainings with social movements and trade unions. This is going to be great. Okay, Dominic, over to you.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks for everyone who stayed to the end. I'm going to jump right in it. I'll switch off my video because I think the presentation's better to look at than I am. So I think a lot of the issues raised, the intersecting problems that the pandemic has raised, has been touched on. And of course, we all know lockdown has been a standard response to the outbreak of the pandemic. Now, in spite of the shutting down of cities, plus dramatic decreases in air travel and the use of motor vehicles, this actually had a marginal effect in the fight against climate emergency. This illustrates the enormity of the task ahead. To put it simply, things are getting worse. We are not getting any closer to averting climate catastrophe. And according to the report from the World Meteorological Organization in 2019, time is fast running out. Faith Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, makes it completely clear when he says that the pandemic and its aftermath can suppress emissions, but low economic growth is not a low emission strategy. Only an acceleration in structural changes to the way the world produces and consumes energy can break the emissions trends for good. And as we can see, based on the Keeling curve, which is an estimate of how much carbon dioxide particles in the atmosphere there are per million, the curve is rising. The pandemic has, of course, put the spotlight on existing inequalities, and throughout the world, in addition to ravaging health systems, the pandemic has exacerbated food and housing insecurity, deepened unemployment, and raised income and wealth inequalities. In South Africa, growing awareness of these problems has brought renewed hope in the possibility of the country embarking on a just transition to a low-carbon economy as a means of recovering from the current crises. Of course, like all countries around the world, South Africa is in desperate need of a just energy transition. The country's economy remains energy intensive, although it's becoming less so. The country is the 14th largest contributor to global carbon emissions, is disproportionately energy intensive, and is a high carbon emitter relative to population size. Consequently, the country has a bigger carbon footprint per capita than the global average. This phenomenon is strongly linked to the historical role that the mining industry has played and continues to play in the country, supported by cheap electricity from an energy system mostly reliant on low quality coal for electricity generation. The good quality coal is exported along with other minerals. When looking at who are the major users and beneficiaries of the mineral energy complex in South Africa, we see that it's these 28 public and private corporations who effectively use approximately 40% of total energy generated from Eskom and who don't pay their fair share. Eskom, which generates 90% of the energy consumed in the country, is in deep crisis as well. The crisis has multiple dimensions and various causes, both internal and external, including A, the 1980s era commercialization of Eskom, B, post-apartheid commitments to provide electricity to the majority of the country, previously excluded under the full cost recovery model, where the excluded majority are unable to afford rising electricity prices. C, underinvestment in the utilities infrastructure, particularly in building new capacity to meet increased demand. D, the conversion of the public utility in 2002 to a public corporation, forcing it to pay taxes as well as dividends for the first time since its establishment almost a century ago. E, Eskom's rising debt, dominated by foreign currency borrowed against a weak rand. F, expensive coal contracts with windfall profits signed in the name of promoting black ownership in the coal industry. And finally, G, dramatic increases in the price of low quality coal upon which Eskom depends to generate electricity due to increased competition for low quality coal in the international markets. All in all then, corruption at Eskom has exacerbated the utility structural crisis. The extent of this corruption is only starting to be exposed following various investigations. One of these investigations was undertaken by the Special Investigative Unit. They revealed that of 5,452 officials, 5,452 officials failed to submit their declarations of interests. That's more than 10% of employees at Eskom. The report also found that 135 Eskom officials are linked to Eskom vendors which have conducted business with Eskom worth at least 6 billion rand on average. These structural problems have entrenched corruption have led to rising tariffs for users in order to make up for falling revenues and service Eskom's debt costs. Most recently, a further 15% tariff increase was approved. Rising tariffs also lead more affluent consumers increasingly to go off-grid, further eroding revenues from users in what has been the utility death spiral. The situation is aggravated by the fact that even before the pandemic, South Africa's demand for electricity was fat and even falling. Many critics blame the crisis in the countries at Eskom due to it being a monopoly, arguing that being a monopoly, mismanagement, corruption, and maladministration are inescapable. But these arguments fail to consider the aforementioned political economic factors that are undermining public utilities around the world, especially as they have become increasingly commercialized under the neoliberalism and the World Bank's full cost recovery model. The full cost recovery model is based on the notion that the full cost of providing electricity should be covered by charges to end users. The validity of this model is rarely ever questioned, despite the World Bank's own 2019 report acknowledging that the commitment of public utilities to a mission of providing universal service and a 100% electrification will result in a failure to reach the full cost recovery benchmark. Compounded by other factors described above, this model lies at the core of Eskom's financial problems. Flowing from this combination of factors, the distance between Eskom's revenue and outlays has widened in recent years, leading to neglected maintenance, outsourcing of skills and services, and greater levels of pollution. It is in this context that some are promoting the unbundling of Eskom, a measure initially imposed by the World Bank as a condition for debt relief. In South Africa, without the World Bank's requirement, this has entailed a partial privatization, even before unbundling, of the energy sector, where Eskom has remained a vertically integrated public utility alongside the private renewable energy program, the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program, the REAP. Under the REAP, several auction bidding windows have been opened, with private contractors competing to win lucrative guaranteed 20-year power purchase agreements. Despite auction opportunities for a total of 14,700 megawatts of renewable energy generation to date, less than 6,400 megawatts of capacity has been procured, and just about 3,000 megawatts has been operational as of 2017. Related to the unbundling of Eskom and the advancement of a neoliberal agenda is government's current macroeconomic framework. Most recently, we have seen the consolidation of government's austerity agenda, and where austerity is budget cuts and or regressive taxes to consolidate debt or the fiscal budget deficit. And in 2020, we saw cuts of 160 billion rand being imposed to the public sector wage bill over the next 3 years, which will lead to thousands of retrenchments from the public sector. The public sector, 70% of the public sector is made up of nurses, teachers, doctors, and correctional service workers. Most of them, in fact, have received on average between 2 and 2.5% wage increases since 2010. This is contrary to mainstream reports that indicate that all of the public sector have seen above inflationary increases. So to be able to cut the public sector wage bill by 160 billion over the next 10 years, we calculate that this will lead to thousands of retrenchments, and this is over and above the existing level of vacancies in the public health sector, where there's 40,000 vacancies alone. And of course, this is across the board in education and most public institutions, the CSMA, SARS, etc. Then in February this year, we've seen further cuts, real cuts being imposed to education, health, and social protection, or social services, the basic income grant. The culmination of all of these cuts leads Treasury, our government, to acknowledge itself that low compensation growth of 0.8% per year without taking inflation into account, it's our words, over the medium-term economic framework period, combined with early retirement, will reduce the number of teachers. This, coupled with a rising number of learners, implies larger class sizes, especially in those fee schools, and is expected to negatively affect learning outcomes. So this really is the government itself recognizing that that its proposals, its budget proposals, and its economic strategy will have detrimental impacts for the majority of the population. Going back to the question of energy and linking it again. So what we are seeing globally is the argument that the private renewable energy sector is able to bring about some form of a transition. And this buys into the misconception that the falling cost of renewable energy will reach a tipping point where the costs of renewables will fall below the costs of energy for fossil fuels, inevitably leading to a shift in investment, with increased levels of investment being redirected to renewables. This way, decarbonization will invariably unfold. However, lessons from international trends indicate that this may not be the case, and that contrary to perceptions, the world is not on a path to decarbonization. So this argument culminates out of research that we have done at AIDC to understand what it will actually take for South Africa to embark on a just transition, given the crisis at Eskom. In this, we have realized that while it is true that globally the levelized cost of electricity, which reflects project costs and not bidding prices, over the lifetime of wind farm and solar installations have fallen dramatically since 2009. In the case of solar voltaic or PV panels, prices have dropped by 88%, and for wind 69%. There are, however, several problems with the tipping point or least cost option arguments. The fundamental problem is that the bidding prices, or that the LCOE, the levelized cost of energy, does not reflect all the costs associated with renewable energy. There are additional system costs that may include balancing costs, adjustments of dispatchable power plants that respond to short-term variable energy capacity, as well as collector stations and other grid costs that include additional transmission capacity. This could all add up to between 10% and 15% over and above the cost of a unit, cost per unit of installed wind and solar capacity. And so, perhaps most importantly for private investors, then, lower bidding prices also means narrower profit margins. The anticipated falling level of profits reduces the profitability and thereby disincentivizes private sector investment in the renewables. This is how to make sense of reports from Bloomberg New Energy Finance in mid-2018 that indicated investment in the renewables had fallen to a 4-year low, followed by a report a year later by both the BNEF and the United Nations Environmental Program that indicated that investment in the renewables had fallen 11% in 2018 to $188.3 billion. Therefore, statements such as this one, such as the one from the International Energy Agency, shouldn't come as a surprise, where they say, as things stand, the world is not set for a decisive downward turn in emissions. And here you can see from this graph that when looking at changes to fossil fuels compared to wind and solar as a percentage of primary energy production, it's evident that there's little change in relation to the global energy mix. Instead, when we look at these things together, we see that there's an expansion in global energy production, with an expansion in energy generated both from fossil fuels, particularly gas, and from renewables, solar PV and wind. This indicates that solar and wind is not displacing fossil fuels in the global energy mix, corroborating the trends taking place in investment. Similarly, for all the hype around the rise in the renewable energy and the unfolding transition, it's astonishing that renewable energy made up less than 5% of total energy consumed in 2019. Mary, are you indicating I should sum up? I've assumed I've spoken for about 17 minutes now. Sorry, I can't hear, which I think means I have 30 minutes left. Is that right? Can you unmute, Mary?
If there's any way you can make it a bit shorter, I think we're losing people and we're running out of time.
So if we, okay, I'll try and. So we need an energy transition, and all what I'm trying to say about the private renewable energy sector and the failures of it to be able to bring about a just transition should open up the door for a public pathway. Now, here we already hear that unions, trade union movements have called for the end of the move to unbundle Eskom, as they have been seeing this as a move to increasingly privatize the energy sector. This perspective is corroborated by many others. For many, the argument is that the unions are entrenched in their interests, and therefore, for that reason, the argument is wrong. However, based on what we're seeing in terms of what's happening to international trends, it seems to be that besides the issue of protecting jobs, the argument against unbundling is critical if we are to be serious about a process of decarbonization. So at AIDC, in spite of our critique of the private renewable energy sector, we remain committed to the need for a just transition. And in 2011, recognizing the need to address both the unemployment crisis and the ecological crisis, we launched the 1 Million Climate Jobs campaign, which shows how you can, through addressing unemployment, simultaneously address the ecological crisis. And here's just we updated the 2011 booklet, which brought together a host of organizations to look at where the jobs can actually be created. And of course, there's lots of work to be done. The housing crisis is but one example. And if you go around communities, you'll see a number of people who are willing and able to work and have the skills to work. The problem is the lack of jobs and the lack of job creation. So we should be moving on a strategy to employ people who are willing and able to work and paying them a living wage. Of course, to embark on a public pathway and to invest in a program that centers people and the planet's needs will require a large level of resources, particularly public resources. Now, in spite of the growing debt to GDP ratio, this in itself should not be a constraint for South Africa embarking on such a program. Just one example would be to look at the Government Employees Pension Fund. Now, currently, the Government Employees Pension Fund has more than 1,800 billion rand in accumulated reserves. A large part of this, and by the way, I should add, it grows by between 45 billion and 55 billion a year on average, and has been doing so for the past 10 years. A large part of this is under the asset management of the Public Investment Corporation. Most of this is invested into the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and the financial economy, which contributes to the massive extractivist program and is partly behind the neoliberal privatization agenda the government is advancing. And we're looking at the size of our financial economy to the size of the GDP. We see that it's close to 360% to GDP. Now, Warren Buffett, who came up with the Buffett indicator, which measures the size of the capital market to the size of the GDP, argues that if your financial market approaches 200%, you are playing with fire. Ours is almost 150%, something like that, almost double that amount. I'll skip other ways in which that we can raise the revenue. And when we're looking at moving towards a more redistributive tax framework, a key issue here is the issue of mining corporations and the way in which they are able to avoid paying their fair share in taxes, as well as their fair share in wages, in what we know as illicit financial flows, base erosion and profit shifting, or what we think is actually profit shifting and wage evasion. So there's lots of resources that can be raised to deal with this. In the process of embarking on such a program, and I think Trusha is right, that we need to strengthen calls for debt cancellation and for the repudiation of illegitimate debts. But none of this will be achievable without the building of movements and a counter power. And I think that the movements for housing, the movements for education, the movements for the improvements of public transport, these things should be at the forefront of the climate movement. And in many ways they are. We need to think about how a housing program can be fit into a low carbon and redistributive macroeconomic framework. Sorry for taking so.
Thanks, Dominic. I'm sorry that as the last presenter, you had to rush through the final slides. It's an excellent presentation, both in terms of content and also what powerful slides you have without too many words, but making a very clear point. We should have more of those at UJ. Anyway, I'm afraid our numbers are falling, but I did want to
Mary, if I may respond to your question quickly. South Africa is blocking renewable policies, which it's not even implementing its own renewable energy policies. Now, if that is true, then why is it that we haven't even been able to tell, besides the contracts that were blocked in 2017 with David Mthlobo and others, since then and before then, why haven't we been able to see the rapid rollout of renewables in the country? And secondly, why don't we see the rapid renewables rollout of renewable energies around the world? For me, that's the fundamental question. And for me, it's quite clear that there isn't sufficient money and investment going into it. For all the fanaticization around how we are embarking on a transition globally, we must then ask, in whose interest does this narrative play into? The fact that a for-profit model is working. I think these are some of the questions that we're not asking in this discussion.
Okay, great. I'm part of the Energy Group South Africa sort of caucus, and there's been discussion about frustration that companies or groups that do want to do renewables aren't allowed in, sort of thing, but I'm catching the tail end of it. It's not my area of specialization. Other comments, questions? Lots of comments here. Well done, great presentation. I saw this slide on the wealth tax, I think the whole tax thing. If people haven't seen the climate jobs campaign information, I would urge you to look at the AIDC website. It's there. Hey, Dominic, that gives a breakdown of a just transition and how people could be retrained if they lose mining jobs to take on new jobs in renewables and in other sectors that can help with a more climate-friendly economy. I think we're all running out of steam. I don't see other questions, other comments. So if it's okay, I'll just conclude. I wanted first to thank people involved, Claire Austin at UCT, Patrick Bond at UWC, Colleen Vogel and Bright Nkrumah at WITS. And I'm sure I'm forgetting people, but that's the team who've helped put this into action. I think the conclusion for me is that we've discussed climate action and engaging with policy and existing processes, and that there's a lot happening with the youth in that, but then putting it in the broader context of justice, of climate justice, and what's happening with extractives, what's happening with different mechanisms that Dominic has highlighted. Dominic's listed his email here, so I'm sure if you want a copy of the PowerPoint too. Claire says, can we share your email addresses? I think that's good.
Sorry, Mary.
Yes.
Had her hand up for a long time. Maybe give her a chance to speak.
Oh no. I was just wrapping up. You say Colleen, because I wanted to hand over to Colleen now to talk about a really important initiative that's a great follow-up and a continuation of this discussion. And then also there's scope if other people want to share specific things that people can get involved with, we will quickly open the floor to that. Colleen? Theo, was that who you were saying, Colleen? Can you unblock her?
Prof, I was referring to Catherine Bond. Colleen seems to have lost network. I'm not sure, it's not listed again in the whatever list here.
Oh, okay. Catherine Bond, did you have a point? I think it may have been a mistaken hand.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put my hand up.
Okay, Prof, thanks. And Colleen is not here, Prof.
Okay, let me, what about you, Bright? Can you make an input on this climate leadership?
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. I was actually, I thought maybe Colleen might be interested in speaking, but since she's not here, maybe I can just briefly touch on it. And I think actually it was just an initiative where it's with a Restless Foundation. So we were actually asked to develop a set of programs where we can actually train youth on the impact of climate change on their health and how they could actually be involved in mitigating climate change. So the program actually involves about 40 young Zimbabweans who actually been trained as to go to the local level to actually guide community members as to how to go into the practical aspect of mitigation. So today we had a session with them, and then we actually gave them some basic tips and guidelines as to how they could actually start their local engagement, and as to where they need to start in terms of starting from crutches and going to talking to community leaders, and also building sort of alliance with those who are working at the municipal, provincial, and the national levels in order to broaden their scope. We are also looking at as to how to integrate or link them up with those in South Africa and in Kenya who are doing excellent work in the area of climate change in terms of building their capacity and giving them extensive training. So it's a program that perhaps we can also be, I think Prof. Colleen has the objective of actually extending it to perhaps to South African context. But I believe there will be another opportunity where she can actually speak to this particular initiative. So I think, yeah, it's an ongoing project, but we will have further discussions with Mary and the other players involved, so that we can see how we could actually expand the scope to involve all interested young people. Thank you, Mary, for the opportunity.
Thanks, Bright. I think this has been a really important event in drawing a whole range of people together. And I hope that we'll see more communication, better communication, this intergenerational dialogue. The list of presenters and their emails has just been posted. So feel free to get in touch with people. That really was the aim of today, to put us all into communication with each other and hopefully leading to action. Last of all, but most importantly, thanks so much to presenters Bright, Trusha, Dominic, Fa, Kulakani. Thank you very, very much. I know your time is pressed and busy with your activism, and we really appreciate that input. So at that, I will sign off. And thank you all for participating.
So, bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.